Welcome again to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. The AuthorCast is a quick and easy way to connect with our authors through audio interviews and readings of their books. In the AuthorCast, we briefly introduce our authors and provide some basic information about the books they publish and how those books contribute to Mormon studies and Mormon writing. In this episode of the AuthorCast, acclaimed Hebrew Bible scholar David Bokovoy reads a chapter from his book, Authoring the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, available in paperback, hardcover, and ebook at gregkofford.com.
Prologue. I showed them that error was in the Bible, or the translation of the Bible. Joseph Smith. This book provides Latter-day Saint readers with an academic investigation into the question, who wrote the Bible's first 5 books? This series, Authoring the Old Testament, presents a basic introduction to biblical scholarship and its relationship to Mormonism. I primarily see this effort as a personal attempt to share with an LDS audience some of the exciting insights I've gained as a student of the Hebrew Bible. Please note, however, that neither this book nor this series provides a comprehensive study of the subject. The present volume specifically explores the making of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The second volume in the series will provide a basic introduction to the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as well as the complicated issue of ancient Israelite prophecy. Finally, the third volume will explore the groups of biblical text known as the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, etc. These 3 volumes parallel the traditional 3-part division of the Old Testament books in both ancient and contemporary forms of Judaism, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Since Authoring the Old Testament has been written specifically for an LDS audience, I will connect each volume with both Latter-day Saint thought and the unique books of LDS Scripture. In so doing, I am acting as neither critic nor apologist. However, throughout the study, I will offer various paradigms that a believer might adopt to make sense of biblical scholarship in light of his or her spiritual convictions. In this study, I am not trying to convert my reader to Mormonism per se, nor to the types of methodologies scholars employ to answer the question, who wrote the Old Testament? The Hebrew Bible is without question among the most influential writings in the history of the Western world. It is a scribal compilation of a diverse assortment of religious text, written over a 1,000-year period. The scholarly consensus holds that these writings, which include various genres such as narratives, laws, poetry, wisdom sayings, prophecy, and apocalyptic text, were composed from approximately the 12th through the 2nd centuries BC. Despite the title of this series, ancient scribes were not authors in the contemporary sense. In his study on Near Eastern and biblical scribal activity, Karel van der Toorn explains these distinctions by stating that, quote, the making of the Hebrew Bible is owed to the scribal class rather than a limited number of individuals, end of quote. And that rather than trying to identify authors, we should instead simply seek to penetrate the mindset of the scribal elite. Van der Toorn goes on to suggest that scribes were artisans rather than artists, since unlike modern authors, scribes did not take into consideration intellectual property in the formation of their own literary work. When all is said and done, the Old Testament is a scribal compilation of assorted religious text, and scribal artisans were very much copiers and preservers of holy tradition. Recent studies on this topic, however, prove that many biblical scribes produced text with impressive artistic creativity, far beyond that of the basic technical skills required of a mere copyist. The scribes who composed the sources for the Old Testament may not have been authors in the exact same way we understand that word today, but they were still authors nonetheless. Presently, most people associate the idea of authorship with individualism and a creation of independent ideas. Scribes were certainly preservers of sacred traditions, but they also used these works, even when recording oral traditions, to create impressive new literary compositions. This book provides evidence that supports this statement. In its exploration of the question of Old Testament authorship, the present volume provides an introduction to higher criticism. Higher criticism refers to a scholarly attempt to explain inconsistencies in the Bible by identifying its original sources. As an interpretive tool, higher criticism constitutes a central part of the historical critical method. There are many academic approaches scholars use to interpret the Bible, including form criticism, structuralism, reader response criticism, deconstruction, redaction criticism, and social scientific criticism, just to name a few. Each of these academic methods has its place. However, this book focuses specifically on higher criticism. Over the years, there have been many helpful introductions to this topic written for a general audience, and this book is indebted to them all. Authoring the Old Testament is unique, though, since it is written specifically for Mormons. In biblical studies, historical criticism seeks to uncover the way in which an original author and an ancient audience would have understood that writer's message. Often contemporary readers of ancient texts assume that ancient authors saw the world in a way that parallels the modern religious experience. But if readers approach a text this way, they fail to allow the original author to share his own experience with the divine. In other words, reading modern conceptions into ancient text limits the original author's ability to tell us what he knows, and what he knows is often vastly different than our own knowledge. Elder John A. Whitsoe expressed this idea with these words, quote, "Many Bible accounts that trouble the inexperienced reader become clear and acceptable if the essential meaning of the story is sought out. To read the Bible fairly, it must be read as Brigham Young suggested. Do you read the scriptures, my brothers and sisters, as though you were writing them 1,000, 2,000, or 5,000 years ago? Do you read them as though you stood in the place of the men who wrote them? This is our guide. The scriptures must be read intelligently." End of quote. By reading scripture critically, a believer in the text inspiration can gain an increased understanding of the various ways in which God has touched the hearts and minds of his children. If this is the reader's first exposure to historical criticism, this book will forever transform the way she looks at the Old Testament. It is a secular approach. However, for a believer in Holy Writ, reading scriptural text while looking for the diverse and often contradictory ways in which authors express their religious views accepts that God speaks to individuals according to their traditions and abilities. This perspective accords with the revelatory process described in the Doctrine and Covenants. Quote, "Revelations were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, so that they might come to understanding." End of quote. D&C 1, verse 24. Revelation is highly personal, and apparently, in his efforts to communicate with human beings, God works within the boundaries of culture. See 2 Nephi 31, verse 3. Identifying the various ways in which ancient authors interpreted and expressed their experiences with divinity can greatly enhance our own knowledge of the divine, even when, and we might say especially when, those ideas contradict our own. Ancient authors' conceptions were often vastly different from those held in the modern era. Therefore, a religious reader gains invaluable insights from ancient sources by identifying themes and ideas that do not reflect his own spiritual views. As a result, this study is not purely secular. I believe that there is a deep spiritual component to this endeavor. The historical critical method is a useful way for a religious reader to analyze text. As we explore the issue of higher criticism in the Old Testament, I recognize that some of these scholarly theories may prove uncomfortable to some Latter-day Saint readers. In an academic quest to read the Bible independently from any contemporary theological lens, a certain degree of discomfort for believers is in some ways inevitable. In my own life, however, I have found that this is not a bad thing. I believe that it is healthy for each of us to question our religious assumptions and to continually use the incredible gift God has given us to search for truth, our brain. In this process, we should not be afraid to ask questions and entertain challenging topics. Many years ago, I was a young LDS seminary teacher with a master's degree in Near Eastern and Judaic studies, and I had a sincere passion for teaching teenagers insights from the Bible. One day I found myself in a class filled with restless students. I could tell from their body language that they had little interest in engaging my lesson on the New Testament. I had nearly given up on gaining their enthusiasm when a normally rambunctious teenage boy slowly raised his hand and asked a question. Though I can no longer recall what it was he asked, I'll never forget the boy's response when I was visibly pleased and sincerely praised him in front of his peers for coming to class with such a fascinating theological question. He said, "Really? Because when I asked my mom that same question last night, she got mad at me for doubting the church." I was shocked. In hindsight, I realized that I have no idea how the conversation between this young man and his mother actually took place. And as a general rule, when it comes to teenagers and their perceptions, I'm typically willing to give adults the benefit of the doubt. But unfortunately, from what I've witnessed, it is true that some within the Mormon community strongly oppose critically engaging religious issues. I've often asked myself the question, what is it about our cultural tradition that leaves some Latter-day Saints with the impression that it is not only wrong to express uncertainty about our theology, but that doubts in any form are a result of sin? Under this attitude, it is never right to question such issues as the historicity of Scripture, the veracity of the Restoration, or the counsel of our church leaders. Some of us have bought into the notion that it is immoral to even ask such questions. Yet in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. In their impressive study, The God Who Weeps, How Mormonism Makes Sense of Life, Terrell and Fiona Givens explain the matter in this way. Quote, "The call to faith is a summons to engage the heart, to attune it to resonate in sympathy with principles and values and ideals that we devoutly hope are true, and which we have reasonable but not certain grounds for believing to be true. There must be grounds for doubt as well as belief, in order to render the choice more truly a choice, and therefore the more deliberate and laden with personal vulnerability and investment. An overwhelming preponderance of evidence on either side would make our choice as meaningless as would a loaded gun pointed to our heads. The option to believe must appear on one's personal horizon like the fruit of paradise, perched precariously between sets of demands held in dynamic tension." End of quote. Viewed in this light, doubts and uncertainty that arise from serious investigation can be seen as an essential component in our spiritual growth. We should not, therefore, treat each other, or even ourselves, as sinners when we doubt. In fact, the acceptance of a questioning attitude is exemplified in the biblical passage that sparked the Restoration. Quote, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not." End of quote. James 1, verse 5. Among other things, this famous scriptural line suggests that God will not upbraid or scold the questioner, since questioning is an essential part of spiritual and intellectual maturity. If the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants teach us anything, it is the power of a good question. Many of these revelations came as a result of theological concerns Joseph Smith developed while carefully working his way through the Bible. Rather than a sign of sin, a questioning attitude should be recognized for what it truly is, a desire to obtain truth. This concept was understood by one of the greatest questioning minds Mormonism has ever produced, Elder B.H. Roberts. Hoping to inspire Latter-day Saints to think critically on religious matters, Elder Roberts expressed the importance of questioning with these words. Quote, "Mental laziness is the vice of men, especially with reference to divine things. Men seem to think that because inspiration and revelation are factors in connection with the things of God, therefore the pain and stress of mental effort are not required, that by some means these elements act somewhat as Elijah's ravens and feed us without effort on our part. To escape this effort, this mental stress to know the things that are, men raise all too readily the ancient bar, 'Thus far shalt thou come, but no farther.' Man cannot hope to understand the things of God they plead, or penetrate those things which he has left shrouded in mystery. Be thou content with the simple faith that accepts without question. To believe and accept the ordinances and then live the moral law will doubtless bring men unto salvation. Why then should men strive and trouble himself to understand? Much study is still a weariness of the flesh, and so men reason. And just now it is much in fashion to laud the simple faith, which is content to believe without understanding, or even without much effort to understand. And doubtless many good people regard this course as indicative of reverence, this plea and bar of effort, thus far and no farther. This sort of reverence is easily simulated, and is of such flattering unction, and so pleasant to follow, soul, take thine ease, that without question it is very often simulated, and falls into the same category as the simulated humility couched in, I don't know, which so often really means, I don't care, and do not intend to trouble myself to find out. End of quote. True reverence, as Elder Roberts recognized, is not a lack of questioning, but serious study, pondering, and inquiry. I'm writing this book because I believe that as Latter-day Saints, we should strive to understand the way scholars understand the Old Testament. We cannot be afraid to subject our religious text to serious intellectual investigation. Again, Elder Roberts recognized the importance of this perspective as well. Concerning the Book of Mormon and higher criticism, B.H. Roberts wrote, quote, "The Book of Mormon of necessity must submit to every test, to literary criticism as well as to every other class of criticism. For our age is above all things critical, and especially critical of sacred literature. And we may not hope that the Book of Mormon will escape closest scrutiny. Neither indeed is it desirable that it should escape. It is given to the world as a revelation from God. It is a volume of American Scripture. Men have a right to test it by the keenest criticism, and to pass severest judgment upon it. And we who accept it as a revelation from God have every reason to believe that it will endure every test. And the more thoroughly it is investigated, the greater shall be its ultimate triumph. Here it is in the world. Let the world make the most of it, or the least of it. It is and will remain true, but it will not do for those of us who believe it to suppose that we can dismiss objections to this American volume of Scripture by the assumption of a lofty air of superiority, and a declaration as to what is enough for us or anybody else to know. The Book of Mormon is presented to the world for its acceptance, and the Latter-day Saints are anxious that their fellow men should believe it. If objections are made to it, to the manner of its translation, with the rest, these objections should be patiently investigated, and the most reasonable explanations possible given." End of quote. Admittedly, this type of analysis creates some problems for some of our traditional paradigms. Some of our assumptions regarding the development of scriptural text cannot be sustained. Questioning these matters with a critical mind, however, is no sin. Neither is struggling with possible inconsistencies within our own religious understandings. According to the Lectures on Faith, Jesus Christ himself was exposed to more powerful contradictions than any man can be. Lectures on Faith 5:2. And quote LDS Scripture, "Art thou greater than he?" D&C 122, verse 8. Even though I am writing this book as neither critic nor apologist, I must admit that I am a believer. But I am also a critical biblical scholar. In my academic training and writings, I strive to avoid allowing my own religious views to influence the way I approach the Bible as an ancient text. I often take the same approach to the LDS Scriptures as well. In this effort, I have often felt that walking and riding in both worlds makes me somewhat of an intellectual/spiritual amphibian. Sometimes I approach the text as critic, and other times as religious truth seeker, using the Bible and other scriptural sources as a revelatory tool. I recognize that this is a contradiction. Fortunately, however, when it comes to facing contradictions, I am in good company. It is my sincere hope that this work will allow readers to find words of wisdom as they seek learning, even by study, and also by faith. D&C 109, verse 7. Finally, because I am writing to a Latter-day Saint audience, when possible, I will cite from the King James Version of the Bible. Any translation is an interpretation, and I would encourage readers to always consider other editions of the Bible in their studies. My use of the KJV in these volumes is designed to show that the observations of higher criticism can be applied directly to the Bible, typically used by LDS readers. Occasionally, I will cite alternative translations. These include the Jewish Publication Society translation, JPS, of the Hebrew and Aramaic in what is known as the Masoretic text. This Jewish version of the Hebrew Bible was first published in a complete form in 1985. I will also occasionally make use of the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, a translation of the Christian Bible, both Old and New Testaments, first published in 1989. When other editions, including my own translation, are cited, I will provide a note indicating the source. So, who did write the Bible's first 5 books?
That was David Bokovoy, author of Authoring the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, available in hardback, paperback, and ebook at gregkofford.com.